One of the questions that comes to mind is, if you have constraints and different kinds of constraints in that, why do we even need any of the fake relationships beyond constraints? The answer to that is fairly simple. I know that I can get translations of this cone to be controlled by translations of this cube through point constraints. I can use orient constraints to install rotational control between these. I can have constraints between scale attributes using scale constraints. However, what if I wanted to make things a little more interesting? What if I wanted to have a relationship between these two objects where as the cube translated, the cone rotated? So in short, the rotate x of my cone is going to be controlled by translate z of my cube. Translations controlling rotations is a sort of a complex relationship uh, for constraints to understand, and they're simply not able to execute something like that. And exactly for this purpose, we need to step outside of the bubble of constraints and understand and learn other fake relationships. Now, in this particular case, since translations of the cube are controlling rotations of the cone, you can understand that the relationships are actually going across of attributes. From translate z to rotate x, we have a name for relationships like these. We call them inter-attribute relationship. So constraints simply do not understand inter-attribute relationships. So we have to figure out a way in which we can install these inter-attribute relationships. One of my favorite tools when it comes to using or installing inter-attribute relationships is Set Driven Key. Now, I'm fairly new to the interface of 2016, and so I'm going to sort of take a minute to figure out where it is, but it should be in the animation section. Let's see. Key. Set Driven Key. Set. So that's pretty much what we want in this particular case. So here's let me actually reopen that window without having anything selected. So this is my set driven key window, and this is what's going to help me set this up. Now, writing or establishing a set driven key is almost like writing a simple little program. Okay, before we get into it, there are two terminologies that we have to acquaint ourselves with. A driver is basically the boss object. It is the object that is controlling in the relationship. It is normally the object that your animator is going to be selecting. The driven is your subordinate object. It's the controlled of the two objects. It's normally the object that you do not want your animator to touch, and hence we are trying to automate it. Okay, we're going to learn about this much more in detail. So let's say, for example, my animator is going to translate this cube in Z. So because my animator is handling this, and in turn that's going to automate the rotation, the rotate X of the cone. And because this is the relationship that we want, my cube becomes the driver, my cone becomes the driven. So I'm going to select the cube and click on load driver, select the cone, and click on load driven. Now, because this is an inter-attribute relationship, you should know that any of the attributes of the cube can control any of the attributes of the cone. Maya doesn't know which one's which, so we have to sort of be specific in telling Maya which attribute of the driver, in this particular case translate Z, is going to control which attribute of the subordinate. In this case, rotate X. Okay, so let me go ahead and quickly set this up for you guys, and you'll know what I'm doing. Okay, when my boss's attribute, which is translate Z of cube 1, is set to 0, so there's a 3 clicks, by the way. If you've noticed it, it's click, click, click. At that point, my subordinate click attribute, click value, click, should also be 0. So those were 6 clicks in all. Click, 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 click. Okay, so when translate Z is set to 0, rotate X should also be set to 0. I'm going to go ahead and set key. And I'm not setting a key, by the way, I'm setting a driven key by clicking the key inside of my set driven key window. Okay, next up, when my boss's attribute moves to, I can manipulate this to, let's say, 10. Then my subordinate's attribute should be set to, let's say, 90 degrees. Key. One more, when my boss's attribute is set to -10, which is the other way around, my subordinate's attribute will be set to -90, key. Okay, close this. First things first, when I select my subordinate, you see that my rotate X attribute, which is my driven attribute, has orange on it. I'm going to call this color orange because everybody thinks it's a different color. But I'm going to call it orange, and orange is what I want you to identify with set driven key. Okay, now see how this relationship works. When I translate my cube, my cone pretty much rotates with it. That was very simple, wasn't it? This is automating, in a way, the motion of my driven object with respect to the motion of my driver, which is fantastic. Just in case you're wondering that what if you wanted to delete this particular relationship, all you have to do is select the attribute, just make sure we go to 0, select the attribute, right click on it and say break connections, and that's pretty much going to get rid of that set driven key. Okay, I'm not going to do that. I want you to certainly try it and maybe control Z it eventually. One of the features of set driven key is obviously the fact that we are able to install inter-attribute relationships, which is fantastic, but also the fact that I've programmed for this cone to follow the cube when it goes from 0 to 10, and then when it goes from 0 to -10. What happens beyond those values? Well, beyond those values, the subordinate pretty much stops listening to the boss. The subordinate listens to the boss in this particular range, but beyond that, once again, it stops listening to the boss. So it's a very interesting feature of set driven key, and we are actually going to use this in an example. So let me open up a file for you guys. Okay, this is kind of what we are going to set up. All right, so we have a castle and a car. And what I really want is, as the car starts to approach the castle, I want the door to automatically open. Now this particular file is already set up. The translate Z of my car anim is going to be controlling the translate Y of the gate. Translate Z controlling translate Y is still an inter-attribute relationship. It is still incredibly confusing for constraints to be able to manage this, and that's why the option we are going with in this particular case is set driven key. So here's what it's going to look like. As the car starts to approach the gate opens slowly. As the car goes through the gate, it stays open. As the car goes past a particular point, the gate comes crashing down. Okay, then all that an animator has to do is animate the car, and the gate will automatically open with the car. So this automation is incredibly important, and that's pretty much the principal word here that we are going to go with. One might ask, why is it so important for us to, let's say, automate the gate? Can the animator simply not animate the gate? Now in this particular case, of course, he can, because it's just one element to animate. But I want you to think big. I want you to think Transformers. Every time Optimus Prime goes from being a truck to a robot, there are all these little knobs, little gears, little things that move around, rotate. If I was to ask my animator to animate all of that every time there was a transformation, he's going to go crazy. So really what we do is we have a simple attribute for the animator which he controls, and then all those little gears and small parts will move through set driven key. So if you were impressed by Transformers, it was really not as much animation as it was rigging, so to say. So let's learn how to set this up. And for that, you will have a file waiting in your Dropbox called as SDK, which stands for Set Driven Key Exercise Setup. So let's start with this. And of course, this is something which is not set up, so my car is going to crash into the gate, and we'll learn how to set this up, of course. So let's go ahead and open up Set Driven Key. Remember, your driver is the boss object. It's normally what the animator is going to be controlling. In this case, it's the controller, or car underscore anim is what the animator is going to be controlling. So let me load that in as my driver. The driven element is what you do not want your animator to touch, and hence we are trying to automate it, which is this right here. Remember, there's no controller for the gate because we don't necessarily want the animator to touch it at all, and that's why the geometry of the gate itself becomes my driven. Now let's be a little more specific and tell Maya which attribute of my car anim, in this case it's translate Z, is going to control which attribute of my gate. Just translate Y. And now starts the process of installing my set driven key. Before we do that, take a look at the road real quick. You should be able to see 4 markers or 4 keys. So remember, what I want is when my car goes from key 1 to key 2, I want the gate to open up. When the car goes from key 2 to key 3, I want the gate to stay up there and not come crashing down. And when the car goes from key 3 to key 4, I want the gate to gradually close. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. Okay, when my boss's attribute is set to 0, my subordinate's attribute should also be set to 0, key. That's your first key. Remember, your 4 keys, which are basically marked as these horizontal white lines. Next up, when my boss's attribute changes to either manually or to numbers, just punch in the attribute, then my subordinate's attribute should change to, let's say, 5, key it. When my boss's attribute changes to, say, 20, my subordinate's attribute will stay at 5. Remember, I don't want the gate to come crashing down just as yet. Press key. When my boss's attribute comes all the way to here, which is 30, I want my subordinate's attribute to be set to 0. Key it, close it, and you see that my gate now has an oranged out attribute, which is now being controlled by set driven key. And there it is. That's fantastic. For some of you, you'll realize that your gate is snapping rather than gradually opening up and down, and that's happening because of your graph editor. So let me quickly open up my graph editor. Here's what on my gate, on my subordinate, your set driven key is very, very similar to setting a key. So if you're seeing a stepped sort of an appearance right here, if that's what you're seeing, then your gate is probably snapping open. So you know what to do. Just select your subordinate, select your keys, and set it to linear. Linear is best for what we do in rigging, and so that way the gate's going to gradually open up and gradually close. If you want to redo this project, restart by getting rid of that relationship, just select Translate Y, right click, and of course Translate Y off the gate, which is the oranged out attribute. Right click on it and say Break Connections, and now you can start out afresh. Your gate is no longer being controlled by the car. So that is set driven key, and the features of which are inter-attribute relationships. Orange is pretty much the color that you want to associate set driven key with, and remember the definitions of driver and driven.